All new tech comes with new issues, and the movie render queue has a number of things users need to know about and issues that many users may run into during production. In this module, we're going to cover some of those issues and caveats, along with the good practices that one should be aware of. Fortunately, most of these issues are very easily fixable. So starting off with an obvious one, if you've ever had issues with substantial blurring, or you get something like just this weird ghosting effect on your first frame of your render, like the example right here, like our image seems to have two different renders kind of ghosting over one another. This is often caused by one of two reasons. That is often due to our camera cut track right here. In general, you're going to need to extend the range of your camera cut track one frame at least before your first frame. So extending it one frame before the green line here and one frame after. Like this. Now, this issue seems to have been resolved in Unreal 4.27, but in the event that you're using 4.26 or earlier, knowing this little trick here, extending the camera cut track one frame before the start of the shot, can resolve this blurring issue. And the reason for this is because temporal samples evaluate on either side of a frame. So when there is no frame before the first frame, some kind of ghosting can occur. But again, this seems to have been resolved in 4.27. Now, another reason for having significant blurring can be because of animated meshes that have very motion blurred bones. This is often caused by incorrect curves in animation data. The joint can rotate by 360 degrees between the frames. With the sequencer open, you can uncheck the snapping button right here, and you can scrub through the subframes, and this may give you an idea if the joints are animating unexpectedly. In this case, the animation is fine, but if your animations are not okay, you'll see it right away. Now, another issue that I've seen a lot of students have is having the camera being rendered in the wrong location or not animating at all. So this is often caused by not having a camera track at all. So if we select this and delete it, you'll see we don't have a camera cut in our sequence. It is imperative that we have a camera cut in the shot. So we need to click on a camera cut, add the camera here, and make sure you have a camera cut track. Otherwise, it's not going to work. You're not going to see anything. You're not going to get the result you expect. Only having an animated camera in your sequence is not enough. And one more time, if you're using Unreal Engine 4.26 or earlier, make sure you extend the camera cut track one frame before the first frame. As of Unreal Engine 4.27, that issue seems to be fixed. Now, next up are issues that you may run into with cloth. If you're noticing that your cloth is starting in the reference pose and settles down over the first few frames of your render, you're going to need to go to the Anti-Aliasing tab in the movie render queue and click on here, and you're going to need to add some more engine warm-up frames. By default, it is set to 0. You can set it to a higher value like 16 or 32. This will give the engine a bit of time to settle down the cloth so that everything will look good at the first frame. Now, in the event that you have a more complicated issue where the cloth is on the wrong side of character joints, what you can do is use the Use Camera Cut for Warm-Up checkbox right here, set that to true, and in the sequencer, you'll need to extend your camera cut back a few frames, like so, as many as is necessary. And you'll also need to select your animation and drag it back so that it lines up with your camera cut track here. And what this is going to do is that it's going to evaluate the animation of the cloth before the first frame of your render. This will kind of help it ease into place and get a better cloth simulation. Now, if you're using the stencil layers functionality and you don't see an alpha channel in the output, you're going to need to open up the movie render queue settings and make sure that the accumulator includes alpha checkbox is turned on. It's important to know that you also need to enable a project setting to enable this. So by going to settings, project settings, and in the search details panel, we can search for alpha, and you'll need to set this to allow through ToeMapper. This is required if you're using temporal or spatial samples that are greater than 1. But also, it's worth noting that using screen percentage, resizing does not support passing the alpha channel through that. So disabling screen percentage and increasing your base output resolution and resizing that in post is a better way to go. Next up is post-processing material issues. So if you are using a post-process material to change the look of your scene, then it is very important to be aware of changed functionality. If your post-process material is set to after tone mapping, then the input data may be very different than you expect. So previously in the viewport, using the older sequencer renderer, the incoming data was always in sRGB space. But the movie render queue will always provide data in linear space, even if an sRGB curve is later applied for the output type. So you might want to know that the material graph provides nodes for converting between sRGB and linear. So if we right click, for example, and search for sRGB, we can see right here we have sRGB to linear and linear to sRGB. You can also use a console command to trigger a custom event to swap the post-process material to handle both cases. This is a pretty advanced use case. You're likely not going to run into this issue, but again, it never hurts to know how to fix it. Next up is a bunch of miscellaneous issues that you may run into. So when the movie render queue runs into issues with your render, it's going to give you a message log window that's going to pop up right here. And this is going to give you a good idea of what that issue is. It's pretty self-explanatory, but one common issue that we often see is the following: too many temporal samples given for the shutter angle / tick rate combination. So, for example, if you set your motion blur in your post-process volume to 0, and in the movie render queue, you've got temporal samples, you're going to run into that issue. The solution to this error is to either increase the motion blur amount, or alternatively, if you don't want any motion blur at all, setting the motion blur amount to 0 was intentional and that's what you want, then consider using spatial samples instead of temporal samples. Next up, occasionally the engine might crash when your sequence is loading a different level than the one that is currently loaded. So like we talked about in an earlier module, when having several jobs that have different levels than the one that you currently have loaded, it might occasionally crash. And sometimes that is caused by running console commands from construction scripts in the actors. Next up is GPU crashes, and you may have seen this message pop up right here. This can be caused by your GPU running out of memory, so you can see the dedicated memory at the bottom of your task manager. When your scene is very heavy or you're rendering at a very high resolution, it is common for your GPU to run out of memory. So there's a few solutions to that crash. The first of which is to use a lower base output resolution. Let's say you were rendering in 4K and it crashed. Rendering in HD may solve your issue. And if you absolutely need 4K, we can use the high resolution feature like we talked about in an earlier lesson. Now, as for the best practices, it is recommended to test often and test early. You should be setting up your cameras and your shots early on and do a few test renders to figure out the sweet spots for your ray tracing settings, temporal or spatial sample counts, and other console variables. In most cases, 8 to 16 temporal samples are used for about 95% of shots, occasionally requiring 35 or 64 samples in extreme situations. Different types of content will require different settings. So, for example, shots with a lot of shadows often need way more samples for denoising. And shots with very fast camera or character animations will need a lot more temporal samples, as opposed to a shot where the camera is mostly static, or just has a very slow pan. Again, test early and test often. You want to know as early as possible if you're getting crashes with your settings and resolutions. You really don't want to be learning the day before delivering a project that your GPU is not powerful enough to output your frames. These things really add up quickly, especially if you start combining high temporal sample counts with high ray tracing settings like brute force and global illumination. Your renders can and will take a very long time. So start with low values and slowly inch your way up until you get to a point that you're satisfied with the result. Knowing these tips can really get you out of a bind in the event that you encounter these commonly occurring issues. That said, Epic is constantly working to improve the movie render queue, so don't be surprised if some of these issues are fixed in later versions.